The engine of the old Peterbilt rumbled beneath Tom as he crossed into the barren expanse of the high desert, dusk spilling across the sky like an ink stain. The road ahead was empty, a lonely strip of asphalt winding between dark silhouettes of distant hills. Tom rubbed his tired eyes and adjusted the volume of his CB radio, half listening to the static punctuated by occasional chatter. He'd taken this route to save time, an isolated shortcut through miles of nothingness, cutting hours off the trip that dispatch had promised would make all the difference. He wasn't new to the life of a trucker, the long nights, the cold coffee, the solitude that stretched like an endless ribbon of highway. But tonight, something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way dispatch had insisted on this route, assuring him it was clear as a bell. Or maybe it was the unease that clung to the edge of his mind, a whisper of warning he couldn't shake. He flicked his headlights to high beam, illuminating the road that snaked endlessly ahead. Suddenly, a message crackled through the CB, a distorted voice on Channel 19, the trucker's channel. "Looks like we've got a lone wolf out on 306, the voice drawled, the static making it sound almost amused. Tom's hand froze halfway to the gear shift. 306. That was his route. He glanced at the radio, his gut tightening. He hadn't seen another vehicle for hours, and he hadn't announced his position. His eyes scanned the mirrors, but the darkness outside remained unbroken. He shook it off, convincing himself it was a coincidence. Truckers talked all sorts of nonsense on the radio. He had miles to go and no time to dwell on it. Tom pushed the truck a little harder, the engine growling as he pressed his foot down. The sound of the CB buzzed again. A different voice this time, low, almost a whisper. "Gonna be a long night for someone out there. Better keep those eyes open." A chill ran down Tom's spine, the kind of instinctive fear that made his hands sweat against the wheel. He flicked the CB off. Silence settled in the cab, save for the hum of the engine. He was alone. At least that's what he told himself. But as the minutes ticked by, the unease grew, the feeling that someone, something was out there, just beyond the beams of his headlights. His phone buzzed on the dashboard, a message from dispatch. "Keep heading down 306, ETA. 4 hours, don't stop." Tom frowned. He'd never gotten instructions like that before, so specific, almost like a warning. He felt a pull in his chest, a heavy dread settling in his bones. He switched the CB back on, scanning the channels. That's when he heard it again, clearer this time, as if the voice was right in the cab with him. "Tommy boy, you're headed right where we want you." His heart skipped. They knew his name. He checked his mirrors again, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. A pair of headlights appeared behind him, distant but unmistakable. The glow too steady, too intentional. He watched them for a long moment, his pulse quickening. Whoever it was, they were following him, matching his speed. He couldn't outrun them. Not on this twisted, narrow strip of road with an 18-wheeler. The CB crackled again, and the same voice came through. "No point in running, Tom. We got friends waiting up ahead." Panic clawed at his chest. He knew he had to think fast, to do something. Anything! To get off this road. He grabbed his phone, dialing the dispatch number. It rang twice before a familiar voice picked up, but something in the tone was different. "Tom, you need to follow instructions," the dispatcher said, his voice too calm, too rehearsed. "Everything will be fine if you just keep driving." Tom hung up, his hands shaking. They were in on it. The whole damn thing was a setup. He needed to get off 306, but there weren't any turnoffs, just mile after mile of emptiness. He kept glancing in the mirror, the headlights behind him never wavering, always there. Then, just up ahead, he saw it. An old service station, its sign flickering, barely visible in the dark. He didn't think, he just acted, jerking the wheel and pulling off the road, the truck shuddering as it bounced onto the gravel lot. The station looked abandoned, windows boarded up, gas pumps rusted and forgotten. But Tom knew he couldn't stay on the road. He killed the engine, plunging the cab into silence, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He watched the headlights behind him slow, creeping closer until they stopped at the edge of the lot. The lights shut off. Darkness swallowed the truck, and Tom strained his eyes, trying to see who was out there. But there was nothing, just shadows shifting, moving. Suddenly, the CB crackled to life, even though he was sure he'd turned it off. The voice came through, almost a whisper. "Come on out, Tom, we just want to talk." He felt a rush of fear, his body frozen. He reached under his seat, his fingers finding the cool metal of the tire iron he kept there. If they wanted him, they'd have to drag him out.
And the sound of footsteps crunched on the gravel. Beneath the cab, it told me with every muscle I tensed down. A shadow passed over the edge. I stood inside that wheel. That no person against the door hard enough to make the whole truck shudder. Tom's grip of the tire iron. He's so white.
"Tommy, we're not going to ask again," the voice outside called, louder now, more insistent. Tom swallowed, his throat dry. He couldn't stay here. He had to move, had to get away. He threw open the passenger door, jumping down and landing hard, his legs almost giving out beneath him. He didn't look back. He just ran, keeping low, weaving between the old gas pumps and into the darkness beyond. He could hear them behind him, their footsteps quickening. Voices calling out, angry now. He made it to the edge of the lot, his eyes scanning for anything, anywhere to hide. Ahead, the dark outline of a drainage ditch cut across the land, a rusted culvert half buried in the dirt. Without thinking, he dove for it, crawling into the narrow space, the stench of damp earth filling his nose. He pulled his legs in, pressing himself as far back as he could, his heart pounding so loud he was sure they'd hear it. The footsteps drew closer, gravel crunching under heavy boots. A beam of light swept over the ditch, passing over the culvert without stopping. Tom held his breath, sweat dripping down his face, his fingers clenched around the tire iron. He could hear them talking, their voices low, frustrated. "He couldn't have gone far," one of them said. The light moved away, the footsteps retreating, fading into the distance. Tom stayed where he was, not daring to move, every muscle aching from the effort of staying still. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, when the night had gone silent once more, he crawled out, his body stiff and bruised. The lot was empty, the truck still sitting where he'd left it, dark and silent. He made his way back, his eyes scanning the shadows, every nerve on edge. When he climbed back into the cab, he saw the note pinned to the steering wheel, a piece of grimy paper, a single word scrawled across it: "Run." Tom stared at it, his hands trembling. He started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness, and pulled back onto the road. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stop, not now, not ever. The road stretched out before him, endless. And somewhere behind him, he knew they were still there, waiting, watching, ready to finish what they'd started. Story 2. The rain poured down, pounding on the truck's windshield as Ryan gripped the wheel, his eyes scanning the empty highway. The job had seemed simple enough when he got the call. An unmarked truck, high pay, no questions asked. The broker had been convincing, the type of guy who knew exactly what kind of bait to use on someone desperate. And Ryan was desperate, behind on his mortgage, kids to feed, and his last job had left him empty-handed after a warehouse went bust. He didn't need to know the details. He just needed the money. He glanced at the dashboard, the clock glowing 2:17 a.m. The highway was a ghost, and he preferred it that way. He had been told to follow the route exactly, no deviations. He tried to ignore the gnawing suspicion that the cargo wasn't entirely above board, but hell, who would care? Cargo was cargo, and money was money. The first sign of trouble came as a flash of headlights in his rearview mirror. They had been following him for miles now, a pair of trucks sitting too close for comfort. He picked up his CB radio, tuning to the emergency channel, but only static responded. No help would be coming. Ryan tried to shake it off, but the feeling in his gut only grew worse as the headlights got closer until they were almost touching his trailer. Out of nowhere, the first truck veered sharply, trying to force Ryan off the road. He gritted his teeth, swerving to keep control. The cab rattled as it hit the shoulder, the wheel jerking in his hands. That's when he saw them, men in ski masks, climbing from the back of the trailing truck, making their way onto his trailer like something out of a movie. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't just being tailgated, this was an ambush. Suddenly a loud bang echoed and the rear window of his cab shattered. Ryan ducked instinctively, his pulse racing. They were shooting at him. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator, trying to shake them off, but the truck wasn't built for speed. In the side mirror, he saw one of the men prying open the cargo doors. His blood ran cold. He had no idea what was back there, but it clearly wasn't something you wanted getting into the wrong hands. The truck lurched violently, and Ryan knew they had control of the trailer. He glanced at the highway ahead, and that's when he saw it. A roadblock, 2 black SUVs parked across both lanes. There was no time to stop. Ryan veered hard, tires screaming against the wet asphalt as he swung the trucks off the road and barreled into the trees. Branches snapped and scraped against the cab, the headlights illuminating nothing but the chaos ahead. He just kept driving, away from the road, away from whoever the hell those men were. The truck finally came to a grinding stop, mud sucking at the wheels. Ryan jumped out, his feet sinking into the wet earth. He made his way to the back, his breath heavy as he opened the trailer. The door swung open, and there they were, weapons, crates of them, guns stacked on top of each other. His stomach twisted. This wasn't just illegal. This was black market material, military grade. He had been moving enough firepower to start a small war. Before he could even process it, he heard voices. The hijackers had followed him. Ryan grabbed one of the rifles from the crate, his hands shaking. He wasn't a fighter. He was a trucker, a dad. But if he didn't do something, he wouldn't live to see his kids again. He ducked behind the trailer, his eyes scanning the trees. Shadows moved in the distance, and Ryan steadied himself, waiting. He fired a shot into the darkness. A shout followed, then silence. Just as he thought he might have bought himself a moment, a voice rang out. Not from the hijackers, but from behind him. "Drop the gun, Ryan!" He spun around, and there stood the broker, the man who'd given him the job. He had a gun pointed straight at Ryan. "Did you really think it'd be that easy?" The broker sneered, stepping closer. Ryan felt his chest tighten. It had all been a setup. They never intended for him to deliver the cargo. He was just the fall guy, the one to take the blame if things went south. "You should have stuck to hauling produce," the broker said, his voice dripping with condescension. Ryan's mind raced, searching for a way out. The broker's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could pull it, the sound of sirens cut through the night. Blue and red lights flashed through the trees. The broker hesitated, his eyes flicking towards the road. Ryan didn't wait. He lunged forward, grabbing the broker's wrist, forcing the gun upwards. A shot rang out and they struggled, the sound of the sirens growing louder. The broker broke free, turning to run, but it was too late. The police were there, officers pouring out of their cars, weapons drawn. Ryan dropped to his knees, his hands up. He knew how it looked. The truck, the guns, the bodies in the forest. But at least he was alive. Hours later, sitting in the back of a squad car, Ryan watched as the officers combed through the truck. He was exhausted, every muscle aching, but he couldn't help but feel a grim sense of relief. He might be going to jail, but at least he wasn't dead. One of the officers opened the door, gesturing for Ryan to step out. "You've got someone here to see you," he said. Ryan frowned, confused. As he stepped out, he saw her, a woman in a dark suit, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Callahan, my name is Agent Monroe. We've been watching this operation for a long time. You might have just helped us bring down something a lot bigger than you realize." Ryan stared at her, the weight of the past few hours crashing down on him. He had no idea what he had stumbled into, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Agent Monroe gave him a tight smile. "How about we make a deal?" she said, her eyes glinting in the flashing lights. And just like that, Ryan realized his life was never going to be the same. He was no longer just a trucker. He was a man caught between forces far beyond his understanding, and somehow he was still in the game.